Ich hatte bereits in vorherigen Podcasts erwähnt, dass Storytelling eine wichtige Sache ist und ganz selten schafft man es, globale Experten hierzu direkt in den Podcast zu bekommen. Genau das ist mir aber jetzt gelungen. Doug Stevenson, der nicht nur globaler Experte bei der Story Theater Method ist, sondern auch in Hinblick auf Storytelling. Und das Ganze hat noch einen weiteren kleinen Bonus. Das Interview jetzt wird auf Englisch sein. Allerdings, wenn man zuhört, dann wird man auch hören, dass er was anbietet. Nämlich Coaching. Und zwar Coaching ohne Berechnung für unsere Zuhörenden bis zu einer halben Stunde. Das lohnt sich. Und wie gesagt, wenn jemand sagt, ich möchte gerne Stories verwenden und eventuell auch ein bisschen aufpolieren, wie ich auf Englisch das Ganze dann machen kann, dann ist Doug Stevenson genau die Person, mit der Sie jetzt sprechen sollten. Von daher viel Spaß beim Interview. Stories. You might have heard about the fact that you should use stories to get your message across, and most likely your message will stick better with people. However, the question is, how do you actually do that? And also, just recently, you probably saw that now anyone has an opinion about stories, may it be positive or negative. The question is, who is the expert on the matter? And the inventor of the story theater method and a storytelling expert globally is here with me today. Hello and welcome, Doug Stevenson.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Thank you very much for taking the time. Talking about stories, many people now jump on a bandwagon and say stories become more important. Should we use them? Yes, no. Lots of arguments going on there between different departments in business. You do stories for a long time, I think. How long are you in business now, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, my professional career as a storyteller and speaking coach is 25 plus years of talking about teaching and developing my story theater method all over the world. About 25 years. I probably started a little bit before that telling stories, but I wasn't focusing on the craft.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So how did you get started as a storytelling expert? Because I don't think this is the usual job where people say, hey, let's be a storytelling expert. How did you get into this?
Well, it's an interesting story in itself. I started out to be an actor. And I did a lot of acting in Chicago and in Los Angeles. I was really giving it everything I could. I studied acting. I went to acting classes.
Mm-hmm.
I did plays. While I was in plays, I was studying the form and structure of plays. And I always was an analyst of story. Even when I was in a play, whether I was on stage or backstage, I would ask myself, why does that scene always work the same way? Why do those lines always get a laugh? What is going on with this form and structure? Why is one play really, really good? It gets done over and over again. Another play is terrible. It just doesn't work. And it's the same with movies. Well, when I left Los Angeles, I didn't make it as an actor, obviously. I went to Colorado Springs. I started over again. I got into real estate. And I started going to these real estate meetings and breakfasts, these networking breakfasts, and they all had a speaker. And most of the speakers were terrible because these were all just networking events. And so the speakers were free speakers for 15 minutes. Well, I realized that they were so bad that I should give it a try because I was an actor. I was comfortable at the front of the room. Well, I got up and I gave a speech and somebody said, wow, that was great. And I gave another speech and somebody said, that was great. And then one time somebody said, you should be a professional speaker. You should make a living at this. Well, I'd never heard that idea of a professional speaker, but I investigated it. And while I was doing all these little speaking things in Colorado Springs in real estate, I had started to tell some stories. And I had this one story that emanated from an acting exercise in Los Angeles. And I call it my streaking story because it's the story of a theater exercise where you're supposed to leave the building, go outside, do something you'd never do, take a risk. Well, my partner and I went streaking and we got arrested naked. Well, I turned that into a story that I started telling people and everybody would laugh and everybody would think it was so good. Well, I eventually developed that story from just being a story that was different every single time I told it, just kind of ad-libbing it every time, so starting to turn it into a product. I wrote it down, I memorized it, and I turned it into a little piece of theater that I could replicate time and time again. And I got hired to tell that story. People would see it and they'd say, I want to hire you to give a speech to my organization. I need you to tell that story. That story is amazing. And that's when I started to realize stories are products. Stories are strategic communication vehicles. And if you've got the right story that makes the right point for the right situation, you can really make a difference with people. You can move the needle. You can motivate people, inspire people, get people to buy into your idea, or more importantly, to buy your product or service. And so it just evolved and evolved and evolved. And it evolved in cooperation with my students, with my corporate clients, and with everybody that I worked with, who would continually push me to explain this, or can we use it for this? Or they'd ask me a probing question. And as you know, our customers force us to get better. And so that's how it evolved over all these years. And eventually I wrote the book, Doug Stevenson's Story Theater Method, and the rest is history.
Yeah, very well said. If we now talk about business, you probably met people who say, look, Doug, you're a professional actor. You feel comfortable with that. I am a business leader. How, as a leader, should I use storytelling to inspire, let's say, my employees? I never learned that. I never learned stagecraft. I'm probably more a numbers person. How would you deal with people who say, I simply don't know how to use storytelling to inspire my people?
Well, you start with the end in mind. You ask yourself, what is it that I'm trying to convey in this presentation? And first of all, forget about the acting. Forget about performing. It's more akin to product development. A story is a product that gets somebody to do something. And it doesn't require that you are a good performer. It requires that you understand the craft of storytelling, the strategic use of a story, by saying, I want to convey this information. If I just do a data dump, if I just tell it, a lot of times people don't get it. And then I wonder, why didn't they get it? Why did they not retain this information? Because data gets dumped, but stories stick.
Excellent. So how do you deal with people? Let's say, okay, we will now have people who say, brilliant, I totally get that. But you most likely will have some people who say, look, Doug, I'm a CFO of just company XYZ. I think stories are a waste of time. Just stick to the data and analyze the data. How do you deal with people who are very anti-story in business to use it as a proper tool?
You know, when I started teaching storytelling, people had to be convinced that storytelling was useful, that it was strategic, that it was going to work better than just like delivering the information. After many, many years, people started to realize, you know, I'm getting up there and I'm delivering my information, and people are saying that I'm boring, and people are doing email while I'm speaking.
Yeah.
And I've got to do something else. So I no longer feel the need or the requirement to convince people that they should tell a story. They convince themselves by being boring, by not being effective communicators, by not moving the needle with a presentation. So what I say to them is, if you're boring, if people are checking their phones, if people are not paying attention to you, if you find out 3 days later that people don't remember what you said, then you have convinced yourself you need to do something else. And that something else is strategic storytelling. And as I said before, it's got to be the right story that makes the right point for the right situation. And it doesn't have to be a big, funny, gigantic, dramatic story. It just needs to be strategic. And the stories are everywhere. You just look around and you tell a story from your life that starts out being a story from your life and ends up being a story about the lesson you want to teach.
Do you think that there's always a good story for every situation, or would you say there are situations where you shouldn't tell a story?
Oh, there's obviously situations you shouldn't tell a story. There's presentations where there's no time. It's not appropriate. It's just not the right situation. But when you're giving what I call a high impact or high value presentation, that's when you need a story. When you're given a little bit more time, when you're given 20 minutes to make a presentation and you've got an awful lot of information that you want to convey, you have to ask yourself, what is the one thing that I want them to remember from this presentation? What is the one idea or concept or principle that I want them to remember? Because the thing about information is there's an awful lot of information. But information alone doesn't lead us to know what to do with that information. Story can kind of put a frame around it and allow it to be something that people understand what to do. So I'm going to tell you a story to give you an example of what I mean. As I developed my speaking career, I was constantly being asked to come into an organization and teach them how to tell stories because they had too much data, too much information. They're boring people to death. They're putting in people into a content coma. And they said, Doug, we've realized that storytelling is important. We need you to help us. What makes you different than other people? Well, for the longest time, I just kind of explained it and I talked about my story theater method. And then one morning I had this experience with my dog. Now, when I was in Los Angeles, I got a dog. Her name was Jaya. She was a puppy. She grew up. And one day when Jaya was about 2 years old, she got sick. And for the first time in my life, I had to deal with a sick dog. I mean, a really sick dog where I had to take her to the vet. Well, I took her to the vet. The vet gave her a little diagnosis. And she said, yeah, your dog is sick. I'm going to give you these little pills. And you give her one with breakfast and one with dinner. And she gave me a little instruction on how you give a dog a pill. I'd never done it before. So I went home and at dinner time, I called her over. I said, Jaya, come here. I need to give you this pill. And I just took the pill and I did what the vet said to do, which is you open their mouth. You pull their mouth open, you shove the pill way the heck down into the back of their throat, then you hold their mouth closed, and supposedly that means they're going to have a little kind of choke on it, and they're going to swallow the pill. Well, I shoved the pill down her throat, and she didn't swallow, but she just stared at me. And when I finally let her mouth open after about 30 seconds, she just spit the pill up. And I did it again with another pill, and she spit the pill up. And I thought, well, this isn't working. These pills are expensive. I'm a struggling actor. I don't have a lot of money. So I called my friend John, who had a dog, and I said, John, what do you do? And he said, well, get some peanut butter and hide the pill in the peanut butter. Well, I'd never heard this before, but I did what he said. I got a scoop of peanut butter, put it in my palm, put the pill inside, held it down, and Jaya just lapped it up, and she swallowed it. She swallowed the pill with the peanut butter. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Hide the pill with the peanut butter. Now, what does this have to do with where I started out with talking to clients about
it's telling stories? It's a very good metaphor, for example, when you have people sitting in the audience, hide the information with something nicer than you just giving them the hard message. That will be my take on it.
Right. Well, the idea is one day, many years later, 15 years later, I'd left Los Angeles. I was now in Colorado Springs. I had my third black lab. Her name was Beulah. I had to give her a pill in the morning. And a half hour later, I'm on the phone with a pharmaceutical company who wanted to hire me. She says, what makes you different? And I told her the story about hiding the pill in the peanut butter. And I said, here's the deal. You've got an awful lot of data and information. That's the pill. Story is the peanut butter. What I do is I don't tell you to delete all of your data and your information and your facts. What I do is teach you how to hide the pill, hide the facts in the story butter, in the peanut butter. She said, oh my God, I've never heard anybody explain it that way. Pull out your calendar. Let's pick a date. I want to hire you. Well, when I got off the phone with that lady, I thought, oh my God, that was the most effective story I've ever told to get hired, to sell my product, to sell my service. And so what I'm saying to people who don't understand about story is you need to hide the pill in the peanut butter. You need to have your data and your information, but you need to wrap it, frame it with a story.
Excellent. So you probably now have met, I mean, that is a brilliant story, but you probably heard of the people who tell you, well, my life isn't that fascinating. I just don't have stories. Nothing really happens to me. Or people have a story, but they don't know how do I find a point in there which is relevant to an audience? What would you say to people who say either I don't have any stories because nothing happens in my life, or they say I might have a story, but I'm not sure about how to find the right point in it?
Well, I just told you a story about giving my dog a pill, so don't tell me you don't have any stories because that's not a big deal. That's really not a big deal. What I do is I look at events that happen in my life and I immediately say, what's the point? What's the lesson in that? So as I've worked with leaders and organizations, as I've worked with pharmaceutical reps and manufacturing reps and all kinds of people in business, I ask them, what do you do in your life outside of work? Well,
Mm.
people tell me about that. Well, they run or they bike or they are really into knitting or they're really into movies or whatever. And I say, well, look at those things and see what you can find from your life outside of work. Just pay attention to what's going on. And you can find a story in a grocery store. You can find a story running a 5K. You can find a story going on vacation to the Maldives. You can find a story just anywhere because you look at it, you say, what happened that wasn't supposed to happen? Where was there an obstacle or a challenge? Because stories are wrapped around obstacles and challenges. And so you look at things that happen in your life. You can go back into your past and you look at things that happen in your life and say, where did I overcome an obstacle? Where did I overcome some kind of a challenge? Where was there some kind of friction or crisis? And what did I do? And in the process of looking at that obstacle and the actions and choices that you made to overcome the obstacle, that's where you find a story. I call them meaningful moments. Rather than some big, hairy, gigantic thing, where are meaningful moments? I mean, when I went streaking, the next morning I woke up and I thought, well, that was weird. I went streaking and I got arrested naked. There's a story there. What can I do with it? And it took me a while to figure out what's the point? How can I find out what's the point? And so I've got stories from traveling. I've got stories from running. I've got stories from giving my dog a pill. But basically, you just have to start developing this awareness of what happens in your life where you overcome an obstacle, and you look for that and say, I need to fit that to the situation and the point that I need to make.
Brilliant. When now some people say, okay, I will probably start to tell stories, or maybe some people who are listening already are telling stories, and they think, I'd like to be a better storyteller, but they just don't know where to start. They say, I probably use stories, but it just doesn't quite work the way it should. I need some advancement there. What are your tips on that, how to become a better storyteller?
Well, the first resource that I'm going to give you is my podcast. It's called the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life podcast. It's an audio podcast. There are some videos on YouTube, but it's an audio podcast. And it's just like your podcast, Niels. It's a podcast that is an instructional podcast, storytelling that sticks for business and life. You can find it on, Spotify and Apple and Amazon and everywhere you want. And basically, I took my story theater methodology that's in a book form, because there is the book, Doug Stevenson's Story Theater Method, because what I am about is teaching the methodology, the strategy. How do you choose a story? How do you find the point of a story? How do you craft the story? How do you present the story? What are all of those hacks and techniques and tools and secrets that professional storytellers and speakers know? And so the first resource that I would say is you go to Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life, and you start at the beginning. There are now 56 episodes, but you go back and you start at episode number 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and you'll find out that there is a strategy to it. And I frame this in the sense of, this is like product development. A story, if it's to work, needs to be developed, just like a product or a service needs to be. You need to do some research and development. But that is a resource for you. It is free, and it allows you to realize that, oh, there is a strategy to this. There is a technique to this, because story is a delivery device. I was thinking about this because I just got a COVID shot, another one of my COVID shots, and I thought, story is kind of like that needle that is a delivery vehicle for the COVID vaccine. Story is like a delivery vehicle for a lesson or point.
Excellent. I know your podcast because I'm listening to it, and also know your book, and I know these are brilliant. If now we wrap up the whole podcast, if now people are listening and say, okay, I think I should use stories, I think I may be more of a beginner, and people say, what are Doug Stevenson top 3 tips? When people now say, I have nothing at the moment, I really want to get started properly. How do I get started properly? What are Doug Stevenson's final top 3 tips to become a good storyteller from the scratch?
Well, first one is to realize stories are everywhere. They don't have to be some big, dramatic, hilarious crazy thing. You don't have to climb Mount Everest to have a story. You don't need to lose a limb to have a story. Just look at your life. Just pay attention to the things that are happening in your life on an everyday basis and look for meaningful moments, not big things, just meaningful moments. Number two, once you decide on a story, you think, okay, that would be a good story. Immediately ask yourself, yeah, but what's the point? What's the utility of this story? Is this the right story to tell for this situation, for this audience, to make the point that I want to make? And if not, keep looking, move on. And number three, and this is really critical, try and turn the point of your story into what I call a phrase that pays. Hide the pill in the peanut butter is a phrase that pays, that is a call to action. It tells you what I want you to do. So a phrase that pays is a verb-oriented call to action statement like make your move, get going,
limo.
Look for the limo, solve the problem, start with the end in mind. The lesson of your story, if it's to be effective, needs to be very short and sweet. And I call it a phrase that pays because when you have that phrase, hide the pill in the peanut butter, it sticks and people will remember it. And it pays off either in you getting where you want to go, you get the promotion, you get the pat on the back, or as a professional speaker, you get hired.
I can fully confirm that because I remember that I heard the phrase look for the limo, which I just said when you said phrase that pays. Right. I saw him speaking in Amsterdam. When was that? 2011, 12?
It was, it was like
15 years ago. And I still remember the phrase that pays from your speech back then. So it works. This was just the proof for everything you just said.
Yes.
Perfect. These are the perfect final words. So you see, stories stick and stories work. So you better get started quite soon when you haven't used stories yet. And I can only tell you, use the podcast that Doug Stevenson has because it's brilliant. Read the book that he has written because it is absolutely amazing. And if you need any kind of coaching or any help on that, because I used it by myself, contact Doug immediately. I know that he's available for that. Am I right, Doug?
Yes, I do. I do online coaching all the time, and I work with people from all over the world. So it's a pleasure to do that. And what I'm going to offer to your listeners is a free 30-minute consultation to anyone who wants to check me out and ask me some questions and perhaps get a little coaching on a story. So the way that you would access that is to send an email to Deborah@DougStevenson.com, DEBORAH at DougStevenson.com. And in the subject line just said free coaching.
Perfect. These are the perfect final words. Stories stick, stories work. Doug Stevenson, thank you very much for your time.
It's a real pleasure to be with you. Have a great day.